For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want to make it extremely clear before going any further. No team outright tanks games. You never see players giving less than their all, or coaches trying to throw the game, or anything along those lines. At the end of the day, everyone out on the field is a professional and is trying to win games and do their job, because this could be their last day in the NFL. Having said that, do front offices not necessarily tank, but look to the future in smart moves? You better believe it. What I mean by that is not that they'll order their players or coaches to tank, but they'll make certain moves to better their chances at being good for the following season, because the short-term gain is not worth the long-term risk. Here's a perfect example of that. Let's say that in Week 8, Trevor Lawrence gets injured with a broken back, and I'm knocking on wood tremendously with that. He's going to be out for the next 2 months, so the Jaguars place him on IR, and he's not coming back until Week 17. By the time Trevor can technically play again, the Jacksonville Jaguars are 6-9, and are mathematically eliminated from playoff contention. Do the Jaguars play Trevor over the final 2 weeks of the season? Do they activate him off of IR? Absolutely positively not. You'd have to be out of your mind to do that. The risk of having to cut a guy to clear space on the active roster for Trevor Lawrence, and most importantly, Trevor Lawrence getting hurt and re-aggravating the injury and now being out for a part of the following season or the off-season program, outweighs the reward of winning a meaningless game, and winning a game that would negatively impact your draft position. You get the idea. Teams don't tank, but front offices absolutely will play it cautiously with certain players if the risk outweighs the reward. Speaking of risk-reward, you've got absolutely nothing to risk and everything to gain by hitting that like button down below, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day about the weird and wacky history of the NFL, so if you like that sort of stuff, then this is the place for you, so be sure to be a part of the community and help us get to 60,000 subscribers. Thanks in advance for your support. Well, I bring that up because when it came to the man that you've been watching this whole time, this man right here, the Pittsburgh Steelers did that with running back and kick returner Don McCall. During the 1970 season, the Steelers made what I can only describe as an absolutely idiotic decision, where they had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. The reward was that the man ends up playing a tiny bit in a regular season game where you have nothing to play for. The risk was losing the man completely and having him off the roster. And based on the fact that I'm making this video, you can take a wild guess as to which scenario transpired. Because more than half a century later, this is the story behind what might just be, considering the circumstances and with no hindsight whatsoever, the dumbest roster move in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers that you've never heard of. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, and one of the dumbest roster management moves you'll see considering everything involved, we need some context to understand the importance of the game at hand that the Steelers were set to play, as in this game right here. It's December 13th, 1970. It's week 13 of the NFL season, and as we hit the penultimate week of the year, we've got an interconference matchup on our hands between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Atlanta Falcons. For the main team in our story, the Steelers, this season has been a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, they're way better than they were in 1969, which isn't too hard, considering the fact that they won just one game that season. On the other hand, following a 4-4 start, and looking like they had a shot at making the playoffs via the AFC Central title, they've fallen off hard, losing 3 of their final 4 games to find themselves at 5-7. While they're technically not out of the playoff race, they need nothing short of a Christmas miracle to get in, so for all intents and purposes, their season is over. However, the story entering the game was about this man right here, who you're watching with the Saints right now for reasons that will become apparent in just a bit. This man right here is Don McCall, and in 1969, the Steelers made a trade for McCall, trading for the Saint running back in exchange for Don Shy and a tackle. The Saints made the trade because they had an abundance of running backs and they needed some offensive line help, while the Steelers made the trade because, as you're watching right now, Don McCall was really freaking good. In 1968, McCall led the Saints with 637 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns on over 4 yards per carry. This was double what any other player on the team had. In fact, during the 1968 season, only 9 players in the entire NFL had over 600 rushing yards and 4 rushing touchdowns, and McCall was one of them. And if his running prowess wasn't enough, he was also a heck of a kick returner, routinely making big plays on special teams and even busting the occasional one to the house. So where was McCall for the 1970 season on the Steelers? Well, the bad news for him was that he was on injured reserve and never got the chance to suit up. During a scrimmage in camp, McCall dislocated his elbow and as a result was placed on IR, so his season was, at least for the moment, just about done. However, by this point in the season, as in the game against the Falcons, McCall was healthy and his elbow had recovered, so the Steelers could call him off of IR and have him suit up for the game at hand. McCall was good to go and could make his debut with the Steelers in their second-to-last game of the year, especially since the Steelers needed some help at running back after one of their backups, the longtime 10-year veteran Dick Hoke, got injured the previous week and would not be able to go. So you might be thinking, what's the big deal? McCall seems healthy, he seems to have recovered from the dislocated elbow, and the Steelers need some help at running back. So just call him off of injured reserve and let him play in the game. I know what I said in the intro about not taking any chances, but even if the injury gets re-aggravated for some reason, McCall isn't going to be sidelined for 9 months and the start of the 1971 season with whatever possible injury could happen to his elbow. It's not as if this was an ACL that we're talking about. Call him up and let him play, because football is an inherently dangerous game, and you can't bubble wrap everyone that might even have so much as even a 0.5% chance of getting injured. And under today's rules, you'd be right. If this scenario took place in 2024 with the rules that we have in place, then I would not be making this video. McCall might be healthy enough to play, even if he's not at 100%. So put him out there and play him since you need a running back. However, we're not dealing with 2024 rules. We're dealing with 1970 rules, where you couldn't just take guys on and off IR willy-nilly and do whatever you want. Because back in 1970, once a guy was on IR, he was out for the season. The moment you put a player on injured reserve, he cannot come back, barring one exception. The exception is that you place him through waivers. If you take a guy off of injured reserve and he clears waivers, he can play for your team again. However, if you take a guy off of injured reserve, every other team in the NFL has a chance to claim that player. As an example, if I use that broken back example from Trevor Lawrence in 1970, assuming the Jaguars were a team back then, if the Jaguars wanted to bring him off of IR for that second-to-last game of the season, they would have to hope that no other team in the NFL would claim him. That was the risk you took, and it was a pretty freaking big risk. It was more than just risking a re-aggravation of the injury, but rather a loss of a player on your roster. So let's weigh the pros and cons of having this man that you've been watching, Don McCall, go off on injured reserve to end up on Pittsburgh's active roster. The pro is that if he somehow clears waivers, you have your replacement at running back for Dick Hoke. You have a guy who knows the offense, knows the system, and knows the playbook, and you don't have to teach a guy off the street. And yeah, that's about it. Because the cons outweigh the pros tremendously. It's like jumping off of a cliff without a bungee cord, where there's one pro, and that is if you land it unscathed, it's a pretty cool and incredible story. But the cons include being paralyzed for life, breaking bones, high medical bills, and death. And again, I'm not even going to concern ourselves with the re-aggravation of the injury potentially, because that feels like nitpicking about a misplaced comma in a book report about Moby Dick, where the student thinks that the whale is a singing octopus. The big con is that if Don McCall ends up getting claimed, and you don't have him on your roster for the 1971 season, and now you need to fill that vacancy and find yourself a new kick returner and a running back. And it would be one thing if, like I said before, this game was worth it. If the Steelers felt as though Don McCall could help them win the division and get a playoff spot, and you figure that it's worth a gamble to get into the playoffs, that's fine, but let's call it for what it is. The Steelers' playoff chances in 1970 were slim to none. With 2 weeks left, they were 5-7, one game back of both the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns at 6-6 atop the division, with the Bengals playing like the hottest team in football. For the Steelers to make the playoffs, their only hope was to win out, hope that either Cincinnati or Cleveland did not win out, and then pray for the best when it came to tiebreakers and even a potential coin flip, because the NFL didn't think that ties would happen for some reason, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Pittsburgh needed a lot of things to go their way, and by this point in the season, their odds of winning the division were the same as the odds of a third-party candidate winning the presidential election. Technically, it's not 0%, but we all know it's not going to happen. So the Steelers had two options. Option 1, keep Don McCall on injured reserve. Ensure that you've got a quality running back on your team for 1971, and sign someone off the street and find a backup running back for the game, since you're still fine with your top two backs of Preston Pearson and John Fuqua, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Or option 2, try and call Don McCall off of IR for a meaningless game and risk the very high possibility that another team claims him, especially since the New Orleans Saints needed some running back help, because the man they traded for 1 year before in that aforementioned trade, Don Shai, was a massive disappointment and wound up getting cut before the start of the 1970 season. And because the Saints had a ground game in 1970 that ranked just 24th out of 26 teams and ranked inside the bottom 5 in every major statistical category. So you know that they're going to be in on the man. Gee, tough call. Tough freaking call here. Keep the man, or almost guarantee the fact that you'll lose the man for absolutely nothing. As if you're going all in on Final Jeopardy when your opponents have $5,000 and you have $20,000. However, if the Steelers made the move that made sense, then I would not be making this video, and we would not be talking about this move more than half a century later, because, quite frankly, we'd have no reason to. But the Steelers decided, in all their stupidity, in all their craziness, and in all their foolishness, to try and activate Don McCall, hoping that there was no way that any team would want to claim the man that had proven to be a valuable asset on special teams and on offense throughout the late 1960s, and was still relatively young. Sure enough, you guessed it, the team you've been watching Don McCall with this entire time, the New Orleans Saints, ended up claiming him off of waivers. Because of course they did. And McCall actually scored a touchdown in his first game back with New Orleans. Said Saints quarterback Billy Kilmer, who you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, on the addition of Don McCall, "I wish we had gotten him 4 weeks earlier. Good job, Steelers. Good freaking job. No one could have possibly seen that coming. Who would have thought that the team that really liked Don McCall and needed someone who could play like Don McCall would pounce at the opportunity to acquire Don McCall for nothing? You gave it to them, and they took advantage of it. Absolutely insane roster management on the part of the Pittsburgh Steelers." And like I said before regarding the incident with these two teams behind me right here, this meant absolutely nothing for the Pittsburgh Steelers. They ended up losing their final 2 games of the season to finish with a 5-9 record. But even if they won out, they would still not make the playoffs because the Cincinnati Bengals finished the season with an 8-6 record. So even if the Steelers won out, they would not have gotten the help that they needed. As things ended, the Steelers finished 3 back of the AFC Central lead. However, what's crazy about this is that This seemed to be a common theme with the Steelers in the late 60s and early 70s, where they couldn't manage a roster to save their lives. The other day, I did a video about an incident between the Steelers and the Falcons, where the Steelers signed a player, not realizing that he was a member of the Atlanta Falcons, and the Steelers had to give the Falcons a draft pick to compensate him for it. You can learn more about that by clicking the card in the upper right corner. With all the crazy roster mismanagement situations with Pittsburgh during that time period, it's crazy that just a few short years later, they would create one of the greatest dynasties in NFL history and would become a formidable team throughout the 1970s. It's almost like that kid in high school that failed calculus and then straight out of college ended up working for NASA. You just don't expect it. Again, you play to win the game, but you don't be stupid about it. There are certain things that are not worth the risk in the slightest bit. And I think it's safe to say, considering the circumstances, that what happened with the Pittsburgh Steelers and this man right here in Don McCall was definitely one of them. If the reward for winning a game is basically nothing except getting a worse draft pick and some personal pride, while the risk in doing something to help you win the game is tremendous, potentially costing you a roster spot and making you need to fill another hole in the draft or offseason the following year, then it's probably not a good idea to take that chance. When the risk outweighs the reward by that much, usually it's going to backfire on you, and it's going to turn out to be a dumb decision, especially when it comes to roster management. However, back in 1970, the Steelers definitely did not seem to realize that. Because on this day in 1970, when it came to Don McCall, entirely because of their own doing and their own incompetence, the Steelers had their players stolen. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.